It's a pleasure to be on today to basically go through really some of the Business Central and Field Service perspective here today, right? So we've got this shiny new feature that Microsoft provided to us regarding the integration toolkit that works between Business Central and our CE or Dataverse environment. And what we want to do today is just kind of dig a little bit deeper into that, right? To understand what are those features that are supported, how can we use this inside of a business process, where should I use field service versus service management, right? So they added this new feature and it's like, well, where do I use this inside of an environment, right? So today, really looking forward to at least giving some of my experience around it, understanding a little bit more of the design, the reasoning behind the design, because we're using jobs or what we call projects now inside of Business Central. And then from there, obviously answer any of the questions that you may have as we kind of go through this. So as with anything, I'll just do some house cleaning at the beginning here. So Stoneridge Confab really is an event that allows you to participate and ask questions around really technology in business systems. And that could be in Dynamics, that could be Azure-based capabilities, basically anything Microsoft specific, because that's where Stoneridge really focuses on really our business is with that Microsoft stack. And what we're trying to do here in Confab is just demystify this, right? To give you more of an inside look on the capabilities of applications as opposed to a software demonstration, which is typically scripted, processes are identified, right? This is much more informal so that you can really understand kind of those initial limitations and then also the initial capabilities that you get, obviously, with our solutions. So that being said, in chat, I know, Rob, you've got it in here as well. Field service right before lunch makes me hungry. You are a glutton for punishment. I am probably the same type of person, though. So I get excited over anything business process oriented, right? So I'm going to go ahead and turn down this just a little bit more because I think it's a little loud. But what we're going to do here today is really just go through then some of those capabilities, right? And we're going to start at the very base so you have a good understanding as to, well, what do I need to get connected to field service, for example. We're not going to cover all the licensing scenarios, but we are going to talk through just a little bit in terms of, well, what about like service management inside of BC, right? Because there's going to be a bunch of different customers that may even be on stream here today that might be using service management, and they're like, well, how do I get some of the newer capabilities like offline, or how do I get a better mobile app, or how do I get like a template that I can have for questionnaires that people can fill out so that when they do an installation, for example, they have a questionnaire they have to go through or a checklist that they have to go through that can then be used obviously from a reporting perspective or even for further or subsequent data entry. So there's, like I said, there's just a lot here to kind of go through, right? So it's not just about the technology, it's about the process as well and how you implement it. So that being said, as you have questions, feel free to ping them in chat here. I'm monitoring it constantly, so I love to have participants. If you want to play Stump the Chump, go for it. We like to have fun with that as well. The point here today is that we really just want to educate as much as possible as we go through that process. With that being said, let's go ahead. I'm going to switch over my screen so you can see it, and let's really start going through kind of our setup here to understand these capabilities. So, yep, learning is great, right, Rob? All right, so first and foremost, I have right here, obviously, a browser window, right? So cool thing about Business Central, if you've been living under a rock, you probably don't know this, but if you have not been, you'll know that Business Central is an online business system that Microsoft sells. High level, it is a solution that we have had in the Microsoft stack since about 2001, 2002. That's when that acquisition of Navision DamGuard occurred. So Business Central then focuses on holding or addressing really what we would classify as the ERP or Enterprise Resource Planning based workloads inside of a business. That means that it's going to tackle finance, it's going to tackle the accounting functions like aged AR and aged AP, it's going to tackle fixed asset capabilities, it's going to tackle inventory management, right? And the cool thing about the Business Central solution is that it's designed to be really that one-stop shop, because when you think about small and medium business, usually businesses that are in that tier need to be able to use a business system for all different functions inside of that business. Whereas enterprise type customers typically have other applications that are even deeper or more expansive, such as like a CRM, right? That goes even deeper. Or, for example, some of the customer service or call center type capabilities. Those are typically more enterprise focused, as you can imagine. But the point here is the fact that if you're using Business Central, you have the ability to connect Business Central then to the other Dynamics applications inside of the Dynamics 365 brand. So this is really important just to kind of note, because if you think about it, if I was going to look at field service based capabilities and recommend those typically to a customer, more often than not, I'm going to recommend field service, not because it's an additional license. And I get like there's a lot of people that look at the Microsoft lens, or when they're looking at Microsoft, they're like, this licensing is crazy and nuts. I don't disagree with you. Like we've got licensing experts that really help with that story, that have the experience, because licensing can be complex. But the real point here is really around the technical and functional capabilities that a solution provides. So I look at it through that lens first, and then I try to figure out the expense side of it, to be honest, because if it doesn't fit the business process needs, it doesn't matter if it was super expensive or super cheap. It just doesn't fit it. So why would we want to sell that, right? So the point here, though, is that within Business Central, we have now the ability to use some of these other applications. And what's really cool about this, from a Business Central community perspective, I absolutely love it. I know that we've got a great development environment within BC, and there's a lot of people that bleed blue, so to speak, that come from the Navision world. But the real difference here is the expansive capabilities that you can now get by using then Dataverse, because you can get field service, you can use CRM, you can start using then some of the Microsoft Fabric-based concepts and Power BI for reporting, right? There's just a lot more that you get then by expanding into that area by using the Power Platform and then using some of these applications. So like I said, there's going to be different opinions on this as you go through, obviously, like how deep you want to have, for example, an integration with Dataverse. But in the future here, I just see it becoming so much more powerful, especially with the AI capabilities with Copilot that are really, really becoming front and center here as we go through these processes. So with that, let's go ahead and just kind of take a look at one of our environments that we have set up that really drives this. So inside of our BC environments here, I'm actually in our pre-sales environment. I've got a database and an environment that I've actually gone through and pre-connected. So that way we can talk through the setup and you can understand what those capabilities are. But the first thing first here is that typically you're going to have, right, an environment that you're going to be linking from Business Central into Dataverse. And the important distinction here for you is that if you look at it classically, you would have two different databases, maybe on-prem, that you would then use some middleware like Scribe or some other tool to move that data back and forth. Well, in the cloud concept, that's the same thing that we have here, right? The major difference, though, is the fact that Microsoft now tackles these native integrations, so that way the value, the cultural impact in terms of what Dynamics is, kind of is encapsulated then in that business process or that need. And I can't stress this enough, because there's been a huge shift in Microsoft in terms of aligning really the business system requirements with these solutions and then the culture that goes around that. Just case in point around that, the UI look and feel between the Dynamics applications is very similar in concept. Finance and operations has tiles and queues, for example. Our lists, as we click on them, all have fast tabs that we typically interact with. We have vertical tabs that we use now in Dynamics to expand and collapse data, right? We've got the search and visualization that's very consistent then with the other applications where our search bar is up top. And then finally, we even have the Copilot sidebar, right, that we see in all the other applications. So this is really important just to note, because that consistency then that's extended between Business Central and then even to Field Service really means that from your perspective, you're going to hit the ground running a little bit faster because you have that same cultural design element that's actually incorporated obviously into all the Dynamics 365 applications. So just a really important thing to note is that that consistency is really important, and it's something that Microsoft is really focused on. Now with that, what you're typically going to have is you're going to have your environment, right? And what I can do here just to kind of show our admin center that we have on our pre-sale side of this, you can see I've got a bunch of different environments, and the one that I'm actually connected with is a sandbox environment in our demo set. So something just to note here is that we can link this obviously with a sandbox or a production environment. If you want to do then the equivalent like a Dataverse mapping with it, you would have a Dataverse environment then for each of the different types of environments that you have inside of Business Central. And just to kind of show that, like if I go into, for example, my admin, that powerplatform.com, and we open that up to look at our environments that are inside of here, you're going to see we've got a bunch of different ones on the pre-sales perspective here, but the one that's natively integrated then is going to be this Field Service BC pre-sales environment that we have linked as part of it. So that's the 5.6 CF environment here. And I can verify that just to kind of start by going back into Business Central and then looking at the Dataverse connection that has actually been set up inside of the environment. So in here, what I'm doing is I'm going up to the search. I go ahead and search for Dataverse, and then in Dataverse, I have my connection set up that you can use. Mind you, there's some automated setups too that you can actually open and harness as you go through those processes, right? But the important thing here is just to understand what environment are we connecting to as part of this. Now, this brings up a really important distinction to start. While we have to have a Dataverse environment and we have to have a Business Central environment to get connected, what we also have to do is go through the base Dataverse setup inside of Dynamics 365 as well, before we can then extend or use the field service-based capabilities as well inside of the Dynamics 365 application set. So just note that you're going to want to go through that initial Dataverse setup to really make this impactful, right? Because you can't just enable field service, you need the contacts or the customers or the products or some of those details that basically need to transfer over, right, from Dynamics 365. So the first thing that you do inside of Business Central is get this Dataverse connector up and running. And from version to version, they continue to improve it. So you can see here, we actually are connected. We have enabled the data synchronization and also enabled the virtual tables between the two environments. If I look at my mapping, for example, with our integration, so if we click on our integration tab here and then look at our integration table mappings, we can see that there's a lot of tables now that we have that are a part of this, right? So some of the things to note though is that, for example, here we have field service project tasks, right, that are integrated, or field service bookable resources that are defined here, or field service customer assets, right? So the cool thing about the integration from my lens and my perspective is that we reuse the existing connector that was already inside of Business Central, and we extended that capability. The great thing about that is that there's a lot of learning around this connector. I know that initially when it came out, there was a lot of struggle from a partner perspective on this integration. And candidly, it was more knowledge focused, meaning how do we set up batch jobs or job queue entries so that if a job fails, it's going to notify us? Or how do we do order of operation type integrations where a sales order for some reason tries to synchronize, but we don't have that customer or the account to customer mapping has not occurred yet inside of the system. So the cool thing about this though is there's just been a lot of learning around that and improvements into the way that the system integrates, to the point now where this integration is really what we lead with, especially especially in the pre-sales process, to talk about how you can natively connect these solutions. Now, there's always a caveat to integration, and the caveats that I would like to just kind of pronounce for you would be, remember, if you update a table inside of BC or update a table inside of CE or Dataverse or Field Service, you do have to go through and then update this mapping capability inside of here, right? So that's just a really important distinction, because if you add a field on an account, well, if you want that field to transfer over from the account to the customer table inside of BC, well, what you're going to do is you're going to come into that record, as you know, and then you're going to go through and then, for example, set up the mapping of the fields that are involved with it. Now, here is a nice feature that was added that makes this a bit easier. You do have the ability to create custom table maps now, and then you also do have the ability to add new field mappings. So if you don't have business logic behind it, let's say it's like a storage entry where we just have a field because we want to store data about an opportunity or a work order or whatever it is, but it's not driving like a business logic event beyond like workflow would be fine, but more like validation events, meaning that when I save the data in that field, there's business logic that runs. If we design a system where we don't have to run that business logic as we add the field, well, you could add a field mapping inside of here, so that way all new fields that you add in Field Service or wherever it is are added then into this integration map, so that way you don't have to actually create a custom extension to then extend or add additional fields to the solution. So this is a huge improvement, and something just to kind of note here as well. And that's something that just makes that integration story even easier and better. The only last thing to note here would be, remember, there's a cultural perspective as well that you need to think through when it comes to the implementation of software with an integration like this as well. What do I mean by that? Well, more specifically, inside of CE, if you come into an opportunity, for example, and you just we're going to implement Dynamics 365 Sales or just Field Service, and you don't have Business Central as the back end. One of the common things that happens in a CRM type deployment, and a lot of the same resources that deploy the CRM capabilities also deploy the Field Service capabilities, but there's a substantial difference in terms of what you should do in those solutions to make it so that you have a really good architecturally sound and progressive solution in the future. What do I mean by that? Well, an example would be if you have someone come in and say, hey, tell me about your customer structure, and we're going to replicate that customer structure inside of CE, which is a pretty common thing, right? You have a CRM application, you have the consultant come in, they are like, how do you want your table structure to be in your relationships? Tell me about it. You have customers with ship tos and bill tos with consultants that you need to associate with it, and what they'll do is they'll build out that customer hierarchy for you. Well, when you connect it to Business Central or to a much more formalized business process system, and ERP is typically much more formalized in its processes, you start introducing a lot of risk with that. And what I mean by that is that in Business Central, we have sell to, ship to, and bill to. So if you can't conform to that customer hierarchy, or have some output of that to that customer hierarchy to Business Central, you're going to have a lot of pain, because you're going to try to then potentially replicate that customer hierarchy concept from CE into Business Central. And once again, the updates or the code, we can technically do it, but it puts you into a very bad position as a customer longer term, because now you've customized the system and you have to maintain that technical debt. Now, sometimes it makes sense to do that, but most of the time it does not. So like I said, you need to consider as you're looking at this what these systems are and how the impact of those systems are going to play with each other, because the example would be, in sales, that's great for an opportunity and lead management and customers. You're doing that hierarchy there to make it easier, but you may break the hierarchy in terms of then trying to use Business Central, for example, to replicate that. So just note as you go through this, when we're dealing with Field Service, Field service is much more of an ERP-ish type workload, right? Because if you think about it, like CRM was leads and opportunities that eventually looked to products and quotes and orders, right? But field service is squarely in inventory and squarely in purchasing, because you've got work orders that are being produced, you've got inventory that you have to move, you have purchases and returns that you're dealing with as part of it. It's a mini process in terms of ERP workload, right? And the recommendation as well from a field service perspective is to not modify its core process in terms of how we move a work order then to an invoice as we go through those transactions. So like I said, I'm saying this just to hopefully give you a little bit of tidbits of saying, hey, how can I help you in the future where you're not going to have pain and you're not going to have that scope or that budget increase when you're talking about deploying field service. And if you have an ERP backend that you're going to be implementing as well at the same time or in the near future, or it's even reversed for that matter where you're adding field service, make sure that you're talking through with a partner that knows both systems, because if they don't know both systems, you will make decisions with a partner that is used to doing it the CRM way, where this new way of tackling things needs to be much more considerate of other business systems and the actual structures that they have in terms of tables and data and things of that nature. So, all right, get off my high horse. Let's keep going here, because what I want to do is just make sure you understand then the main areas that they've added then for integration with field service is going to be obviously our work orders. It's going to be in our products and services that are on work orders. It's going to be on our customer assets, and then it's also going to be on our bookable resources. Now, remember, inventory is going to be needed inside of field service too, but remember that's part of the base Dataverse setup that's inside of here, right? So the CRM setup that you actually use for products and price lists really then comes basically with that, right? So just note that you're going to want to use that too. One final thing, how do you know like the Dataverse, because there's now 3 different setups for connectors, right? You've got your Dataverse connector that you set up. You also have the Dynamics 365 connector, right? And the Dynamics 365 for sales integration, as you can see here as I click on it, looks really, really similar. I mean, the form almost looks exactly the same. Well, the key thing here is it kind of is, right? So the point is that they have different setup tables that are defined for Dataverse and then for Dynamics 365, but you can tell then which table set is part of, like, if I didn't have Dynamics 365 sales, what tables could I synchronize between Business Central and then to Dataverse? Because maybe I want to build a model-driven app where I don't need to have like CRM data. Well, I could do contacts, I could do accounts, I could do currencies, right? I could do, as you can see here, the accounts as well, shipment methods. So here what I'm just kind of identifying is the fact that these integration tables tell you then really where that setup is located, right? So Dataverse would be really that Dataverse setup. CRM would then be the Dynamics 365 sales setup. And then now we have FS Work, right? Or FS at the beginning of it. That would then be the field service connector or extension that would then enable basically that integration table. So a really quick and easy way basically to know then like which of these setups do I have to do. But if you're going to be using field service with inventory, as you can see here, you're going to want to be then integrating the Dynamics 365 for sales portion of this as well, so that we have products and so that we have quantities. Please note that when you deploy this, like for an item, especially if you're like halfway through as part of this, if you go into the mapping and you look at the fields that are related to it, there's a field that's not defined inside of here that you may have to update your existing records for inside of field service. So an example would be, let's say that you got the connector all set up between Dataverse and all that set up and we haven't enabled field service yet. Well, when it creates those products inside of field service, there's a field service product type field that needs to be populated, and by default, it's not populating that value, and that value is either inventory or service as a part of it. So just note that you may need to do some updates to the data after your first synchronization, so that way you can get the right products that are listed as well then in lists inside of field service as you're interacting with it. On Microsoft's page, they have on YouTube, they've got a setup or a demonstration that they went through that highlights how to address it. But I just want to call that out because I ran into that even when I did my setup, where I had to basically just create a quick list for the products inside of Field Service. I exported that list, then it just had one column in it, which was the Field Service product type, and then I updated all those product types to inventory or service so that I could then use them inside of the environment. So note that that might be something that you have to do. Now, when you go through your final setup here, you've done the setup obviously for Dataverse. We now have, as you can see here, a field service setup that we can actually do as a part of this, right? So as you can see here, now we have the Dynamics 365 Field Service integration setup, right? And so if I click on that, some of the setups that are kind of specific then to field service are going to be, for example, the project journal template. So how Microsoft tackled the field service integration is basically they made it so that you can associate a work order with a project inside of Business Central. And this is good in a lot of ways. We have a lot of customers that can use this capability, meaning what's going to happen is that they're going to define a project. Like let's even pick on some type of siding repair as an example. Well, what I can do inside of Business Central is I can create a new project that's related then to that siding. And then what I can do beyond that is I can create, for example, multiple project tasks that outline kind of the steps that I go through in that project, such as initially demolition and removal of siding, right? It could then be, for example, maybe we're going to put some Tyvek on it, and that's a different team. So you can actually, for each of those different types of projects that we're going to look at, then have basically a work order related to any of those workloads that are being tackled then by a business user. So as part of that, though, we then post back inside of Business Central those details that come from the work order, such as the product or the service, that then allows me basically to generate that invoice from a work order inside of Business Central. So note that if you want to use the field service capabilities right now inside of BC, it is very project specific. Now, Stoneridge has created a couple different integrations as well, and we have integrations that go beyond than this. More specifically, I demoed this in one of the prior confabs last year, where we did the extension to the field service setup as well, and we tackled it even further than that. We had it so inventory is moving between the two. We have it so as well that we can actually generate, for example, work orders, and when those work orders are generated as a list inside of Dynamics, we can access that. And then finally, what we can do is from a work order, we can invoice it, and it creates a sales invoice as opposed to then using a project for it. So like I said, there are partners out there like Stoneridge that have also created different integrations that then address other specific needs for industries, right? So if you're an industry, for example, that needs to be able to fulfill work orders and service and things of that nature that you're doing, and what you want to do is start that maybe inside of field service, but then get the invoice to Business Central as a part of it without having to do a project. Well, that's another option that you have, right? That could be opportunity to work order to work, and then from work order to invoice. Well, at the invoice event, basically that's when Business Central then has its created records. So like I said, there's a couple of different options we have to set this up with, but you need to know that this works with projects out of the box. There's also, as you can see here, some synchronization settings, right? So when do I synchronize the work order for the products and services? In our default environment, we have it set it up when they're used. And then when do we automatically post? And in this example, we post them manually when those lines get created, right? So beyond that then, in our mapping, you can come to the integration table mappings. You're going to see the full list again here, right? But the FS ones are really going to be the ones that you're going to focus on as part of it. So once you have those connected, you're pretty much set at that point, right? Once we validated that everything is working, note that on your synchronization jobs, like if we look at the run full sync here, if I actually click on it and bring up that page, what we're going to see here then is that, these are typically with the job queues that run as we go through those different processes, right? I like this screen. It actually shows you pretty quickly here, like what jobs have been run, what have failed as well as they've gone through it. Examples here, so everyone's like, Scott, that's lots of errors there, right? If I click on the error, you can see what it is. And this one, as part of the coupling setup, I just don't have the coupling rules set up correctly for the table mappings, right? So in this example, you need to specify which fields are going to be used in that mapping for the match-based coupling. So either way, just something to note is that this screen really gives a nice area to see exactly like how things are running inside of the environment, right? And then you can also, as you can see here, right, go ahead and then do updates to it to say, for example, well, in this situation, I want to couple this by the name of the actual job, right, that's happening for it. So once again, this is a nice area, and all of the field service coupling type scenarios are also integrated into here as well. Now, beyond that then, once we've done that setup, we're pretty much ready to start looking at how we can actually then create, for example, field service work orders then inside of the system. So let's kind of go through that process so you can kind of see then what that means. So first and foremost, what we're going to see here in our environments, I'm going to go ahead and crack this one open. So that way we've got it kind of on screen here so we can go through this in a little bit more detail. And what we're going to see just really quickly here is, as we go ahead over to really our environment URL, we'll go ahead and crack that open. And I should have then a field service app that I'm on by default, which is correct, which is fantastic. So in this environment, so in field service, when we stand up a Dataverse environment, what we did in this environment, for example, is that we installed field service as an app, we installed customer service, and we installed Dynamics 365 sales inside of here. You may be asking, well, how do I create Dataverse environments? Like, let's say you're even at that basic of a level and you understand the BC stuff that I went through. You can really just easily, right, go to your environments and admin.powerplatform.microsoft.com, create new as an action, define the name with it, right? So this would be like field service integrated as an example. We've got some security groups that we use inside of our environment. You can specify it as a sandbox environment. You can see I've got to add a Dataverse data store that's inside of here, and I can click on next. And then what I can do here is I can enable the Dynamics 365 apps and then select, for example, field service, sales enterprise, and customer service, right? And then do that deployment. And in this example, I'm going to do a no security group, right? And click on save, and that's going to create then your Dataverse environment, right? That's going to then basically have the tables for field service and even some of the demo data you can load then as well at that point. If you start with a blank solution then, well, then you can just have BC populate, for example, the customers, the products, and some of those details then inside of the environment, which is kind of nice, right? That way you can kind of see like what's my implementation path here as I go through this. Now, inside of Business Central, once you've set up that field service, area, you could log into it. In my default here, I've got some dashboards like my connected field service and then also my field service admin dashboard that's inside of here. And what you're going to see on the far left here then are like work orders, right, and bookings, and there's lots of different setups that are in here too that you may want to consider, right? So on our service here, remember, inside of field service settings, there's a lot of different setups basically that drive some of the behaviors that you may want inside of that environment, right? So just note that, this look and feel then when we're talking about some of those field service workloads that you're going to tackle, they're going to be inside of this application and not inside of Business Central. Now, one of the areas that you probably saw right away is that when we deploy that particular integration, it actually installs a solution, and that solution then exposes additional fields or tables that are then accessible inside of field service as well, right? So as you can see here, I've got my BC project tasks that are inside of here, where we have all of our details then regarding all these different project tasks that are set up then inside of here. So this is the example then of basically the linking basically between Business Central and then also to that of Field Service. So let's go through some of these different scenarios to start looking at like how would we actually like create a work order as an example and associate it with a project, so that way we could actually go through some of that processing. So high level here, if we go into Business Central again, so I'm going to bring this over here, we're back inside of Business Central. I may want to, for example, start some type of a project where we're going to do, let's just do a siding replacement, right? And just create something really quickly just to show that. So what I would do here is I would search for projects, or maybe in my role center, I'd already have projects that are set up. If you're on previous versions, this is jobs, right? So we have a rebranding that occurred obviously with this. If I click on that, what I should be able to do then inside of here is actually then go ahead and then create basically a new project. So if I click on the new action here and then tab off of it, I should hopefully get an auto incremented job number that is here. I can go ahead and say this is my siding project that I'm going to tackle. And then what I can also do is I can select then the customer that's going to be used for that siding project. Now, I want to check something real quick here, like from an account perspective over here. If I click on my accounts, what I should see is a very similar list of accounts when I highlight the all accounts because I'm not attached to them, that relate then into possibly that Business Central environment, right? So we've got a lot of different customers that are inside of here. Well, in this example, do we have like the Canon group, right? So if I type in, we'll just even type in group as a part of it, what we can see is that we may not have a record coupled then with Field Service, right? So just like the standard capabilities that we looked at inside of Dynamics 365 Sales, remember that on these accounts, if you actually go ahead and look at an account inside of here, when you enable basically that synchronization, as you can see that synchronize right here, what you have is that you typically couple or relate basically a record to another record inside of, as you can see here, Dynamics 365 Field Service, right? So you can see here in this example that it looks like we do have the Canon group that's inside of here, right? So if I go to my all accounts again, and let's try searching again because maybe I did the wrong keyword. Once again, that's how you can then see just really quickly like what coupled records are there or not. Case in point with this, it's really common inside of a deployment scenario to have like a Power BI report that you use basically to look at master data, and it basically filters and identifies records that are possibly not coupled between Business Central and Field Service. So note, you may want to consider doing some of those just from a manageability perspective with it. There are reasons why you may not have a coupled record between Business Central and Dynamics 365 Field Service, right? And that's the flexibility of configuration in our environment. Even in the setup of this, we have the ability to go through and then define the fields and when the actual system will create automatically coupled records, right, as part of that process. That's part of the deployment process. You need to know that. You need to understand the fact that when we go through the integration for this, we're going to be making sure then that those business scenarios are tackled, and then from there you can choose then, well, how do I want to set up the coupling? What records do I couple? Which ones do I set to automatically do that to basically reduce that overhead that you have? We can see here, though, on the Canon group, if I actually select the Canon group and look at it, all that detail that was from Business Central then, and over here on our far right, we've got some of those Business Central customer number details that have come from that fact box detail into this record or the account record as well. And we can see on April 11th is really when we actually created this record or synchronized it between that and Business Central. Now that we have this particular account, the other things that we're going to need, as you can probably imagine, are going to be things like products, right? So in this example, if we look over on our far left here, we've got a couple of different areas where we can access that product detail. But what I would do is click on my service down here, and you probably can't see because my mug's in the way, but I'd click on service here, and then what I'd do is I'd actually go, for example, to inventory, and maybe then set up or look at some of the different product inventory that I have inside of here, right? So if I click on that product as an example, we should then get to the product inside of field service, and then in the product details, right, you may want to do some of the updates in terms of, price list or details that are related to it. The field service field here, as you can see, is also the critical area. And this is where I'm talking about then that field service product type that you may need to export and then update, so that way you can set this as inventory, especially if you don't see it in any of the lists. So just note, this is another one that's synchronized then with the base capabilities. So that way you've got typically those product details that are inside of here as part of that process. Now beyond that then, what you're going to do is you're going to continue, obviously here inside of Business Central, if we go back and we go to that project, let's use the Canon group as part of this and click on OK for it. And then in the tasks, let's start creating some tasks inside of here. So we'll do 10, we'll call this the demolition, right, that we would do as a part of it. We're going to say that there's a separate team then for the, we'll do the Tyvek as part of it, as part of that process. And then what I could do is do another one and then do, for example, down here, I could actually do a 30 and say this is, for example, beyond demolition, this would be maybe siding install, and then a final one would be probably like cleanup, right? So this would be cleanup as a part of it. So what I've done here is I've created really, 4 separate project tasks that are inside of here that I should basically now hopefully have the ability to see these particular project tasks inside of field service, right? So if we take a quick look at that, if I go, for example, to field service now and we look at our BC project tasks that are inside of here, well, what we're going to see from a job number perspective is if I filter then that job, we have that detail then inside of here, right? So you can see I've got demolition, siding install as a part of this. It looks like we've got a task description that hasn't updated yet on cleanup. So I'll just do cleanup test as a part of it, right? Because this is kind of interesting. Let's go ahead and then refresh this to see what happens, to see if it gets that update. So there are some things to just kind of work through inside of this integration that are just design patterns that you need to think about as well. One of those is the fact that some of these updates, like the modify type events, what Business Central does is it tries to batch those together as much as possible. So that way when we're writing back into Dataverse, we're not writing individual records, which is really expensive. Instead, it's grouping that, right? So note that some of these particular tasks, like in this situation, we don't have, for example, that cleanup value that's inside of here. Well, the primary reason for that is because that job didn't run that identified all those updates, and when it runs then, new inserts are almost immediately brought over into Dataverse, whereas modifications and deletes and updates, or basically there are updates and deletes, maybe is what I should say, are actually then batched, and they're batched then through that job queue. So that's a design pattern of the actual integration technology that's used. But you can see here, over a set amount of time, it does catch up and catch those modifications. Just make sure that you've got that job queue set up that really drives that. Once again, you can get to that by going into the field service setup and then going to the integration table mappings. Now, in this particular one, we can see I've got my project that's been created. I could then go into here as well, right, and then add like my planning lines that are related to it, right? You could add, like let's try it, right? So demolition, let's say that we've got, a budget or a billable that we're expecting a specific resource. We'll do Catherine as an example here to spend 8 hours on this, and we're charging them $19 an hour for that type of service, right? So what's interesting about this is, remember, the planning lines really don't have much of an impact on the field service work order. Case in point, let's do a work order and just kind of show that then, because we've got the ability here to create that work order. So what I can do is I can say, yeah, let's create a new work order inside of the solution. And in that work order, what I can do here is I can actually specify, for example, who is the service account, so I could say it's the Canon group in this example. What's the work order type if I have any that are defined? So let's just do a drain tile as part of it. We'll associate it with that. And then from here, what I can also do is then see the list of different projects that are inside of here. And what you're seeing is that it's not just the project, it's also the project task that's exposed inside of here as well, right? So this is an example then of really the ability for you to go through and then look up that Business Central data for that siding project. So maybe I would type in siding right as a part of it, and then my tasks that were actually listed inside of there, the 10, 20, looks like we've got 30 here, and then 40 are exposed. And what I could do is then align, for example, that particular work order to that project task that's being tackled. So then what I can do here, if I have an incident type that would then, for example, have some type of a list that I would be interacting with. For example, inspection types allow me to go through and then define inspection templates I could use as well to basically do a questionnaire. Basically what you can do though is you can use those to drive that. Now what I can do here is I can go ahead and then create that work order, and here's the cool thing about it. Now that I actually have this integrated with BC, basically this work order is associated with this project, right? And I know a lot of you are going to be like, well, I want to see it from inside of Business Central, right? That is one of the things that, I think in the future could be expanded out, meaning having a menu item on here on the project to say work orders that are related to it would be a really nice capability, right? That would be added. If we look at our related detail here, we can see we've got timesheets and things of that nature, planning lines, but I'm not seeing yet any of that detail from, as you can imagine here, field service as a part of it. So no, one of those limitations, you can still get to that list though, because in field service, we're associating obviously that project, or what we call the external project then, with this particular record inside of the environment. So from here, what I can do on a work order as an example is I can then use some of the great capabilities of field service, right? So I could come in here to my products and services as an example, and I remember that product that we added or that service isn't referenced inside of here, right? So this is a really important distinction. Once again, the planning lines that are on the project aren't really being used or consumed to auto create a work order. So you may have a situation where you create a project, you add those lines, and you want the system to automatically create the work orders. Well, you're going to have to create some type of automation around that, and that's really easy. You could use Power Automate or Logic Apps as an example, because inside of BC, remember, you have the ability to snap in and automate. And I would just recommend, if you want to have like those automated type events, obviously you're going to want to set up maybe some fields that manage it inside of Business Central. But what you can then do is just use an automate basically to create those particular work orders and then do exactly what I did here. Even to the point where if you wanted to have it where the products that were listed inside of the planning lines, you could have the system come in here and then say, hey, add that service or add that particular value inside of it, right? So if I look for services, I don't have any services in this environment, so I'll go ahead and just discard those changes. But if I look at products as an example, we'll try adding products inside of here. And let's see if I've got the right list inside of here. Yep, I do. So in this example, let's say like we're doing cleanup and we're going to need to get a pump out there to actually do that cleanup for the siding, right? And we're going to say we're going to need one of them as an example inside of here. So one of the things that you're probably noticing already is the fact that when we create, for example, this product and then add it to a work order, well, what about like, what warehouse we're sourcing this from? How are we representing, for example, the different types of details that are needed for this, right? And some of the fields that we can see here, if I just quickly look, I think I've got a price list issue that I've got to look at, which might be in the other. There it is. We should be able to set the default price list inside of here. Net result, though, is that when we're adding these particular products inside of here and looking at product quantities, remember that the on-hand quantity is really then coming from that integration. So if we don't have that working, well, you're not going to see those product quantities. The other thing to note is that when we're doing these types of transactions, if I consume it, right? And right here, we're saying we're consuming it from the main warehouse. There's nothing inside of Business Central that is saying that we are demanding that product quantity for that particular work order unless you come into your project planning lines and then add, for example, that item inside of here, right? So you have to remember that if I'm an end user and I come up to my work orders and I build my work order out where I'm going to have that pump and a couple other products that are inside of here, well, what you're going to see here at the line level is that we're not going to have then those product lines that are inside of here, which means we're not driving demand as a part of it. So one of the other things that you should be considering would be, well, how am I getting that communicated demand back into Business Central? Because usually Business Central is going to be using the MRP process to do the reordering for it, right? So just note that you're going to want to think through that a little bit, and we can help through that. But the net result is that either if you want to have demand that's created for example, that supply requirements, well, what you're going to want to do is you're going to want to create an automate more than likely as well inside of field service that would bring that product, if it was added, back into then Dynamics Business Central to drive that demand as a part of it. Now we can see here as well, if I look at it, we've got an estimated quantity of 1 that we're going to use as a part of it. Well, what I can do with this work order is I can actually then go ahead and then book it, right? And here's where it gets really fun, right? Because now I can use things like, oh, okay, fantastic. I can use like the very rich and robust scheduling board that we have here, right? So if I open this up as an example, what I should be able to see is basically all these different resources and then the work that needs to be done. And then I can use like drag and drop, right, to actually put that particular work order and assign it then to a tech in this example. The other thing to note is that inside of Business Central now, if you actually, so we'll go out of our project just really quickly, if you actually go to the resource inside of Business Central, resources are now also synchronized basically with bookable resources that exist inside of Field Service. So what you can do here is you can set up basically that resource that's related to it. An example might be, you know, I could actually do a Scott F or something like that, right? And then I could say Scott Frappier, and I could say I'm billed by hour or whatever that is, right? So I don't know if I have hours set up. It doesn't look like it. So we'll do it by pieces. Scott is sold in pieces. So, and I can put my cost in terms of what that resource is. I could then state, for example, what that profitability percentage, I always want to make 30%, or I could say I bill Scott at $250 an hour. And then from there, as you can see, you can do all of your other financial setups, right? Of like what tax group are they in, what product group may be related to them as a part of this, which would be services as an example. And then finally, what happens here is I can save this record and then I can synchronize it and set up then that coupling basically back to then Dataverse, right? So in this example, I could actually create a new record inside of Dataverse as a part of this. And when I click on OK, then when that synchronization occurs, what we're going to see is that eventually it's going to create that bookable resource once that syncs job actually completes. And you can see here, it actually inserted it. And then basically inside of our bookable resources, if I actually look at the detail related to this, what I should be able to see then inside of Field Service eventually is that that bookable resource inside of our setup and our resources inside of here would then also exist. And you can see that it did add it inside of here, and more than likely it's related to this particular record that then was enabled. And then you can do some of the field service setup, like set up the hours that are related to it, so on and so forth. The reason I'm mentioning this is that this allows you then very easily to really set up that schedule board to reflect the resources that are inside of Business Central and then the resources that you can use to do the assignment for that work order. Now, once a work order's been assigned, you know, what are you going to do? Well, you're going to execute against it, right? So you may, for example, open up a role tailored client on your tablet or on your desktop, right? Maybe you do want to use this type of look and feel. I guess the big thing to note here is the fact that, remember, with Field Service, you have a mobile app that you can also install and use. And if you recall, when we looked at these different apps that were inside of here, there's even a Field Service mobile app that's already pre-tailored then for that mobile experience. And then you can take this and even extend it further. So the advantage of that is that you can use features now that we don't have in the service management of Business Central. You can use, for example, geofencing now. You can use offline capabilities inside of Field Service to basically ensure then that your techs, if they need to go offline, can use basically the Field Service then mobile app as a part of it. You get the ability now to use Power Pages, and you can do portals, for example. If you want to recreate the Papa John's Pizza Tracker, where you're tracking your techs as they're going out and being deployed into the environment, well, you can actually have a portal that people can log into to see that detail. So it just expands so much of what you can do then from a field service perspective. You know, eventually what's going to happen, though, is you're going to start consuming products, right? You're going to come to this, for example, and whether it's in the mobile interface or if it's in the client interface or desktop interface, you're going to reflect, for example, a quantity that you use. So I'm going to say I used one of these as an example and then save that away. And you can see here then our status field indicates that we have actually gone through and used this pump as an example. I could then also add additional services here, right? So I could come in here and say, for example, what are those services that I want to have, but you can see I don't have any service products that are set up inside of the environment. Finally, I'm going to go ahead and discard those changes. What I can also do is then use like some of the tasks. So if I actually had, for example, different type of tasks that I addressed, as an example, I could come in here and say, well, what's my task type that's related to this? Maybe I did some type of inspection, or I did some paperwork that was a part of it, and I'm going to say it's 100% complete, and it was basically an hour of time I needed to do that in, right? And I can mark it as complete as well. So once again, this field service type capability just allows you then to see, for example, some of those details and questionnaires on the related information too, just to kind of highlight this. I mean, we can get back then to opportunities that are related to this. We can have purchase orders that we generate off of this. We can have time entries that we're maintaining, right? So just something to note is that, you know, you've got a lot of great capability then from a work order perspective to really drive that. Now, finally, what's eventually going to happen here, you go through, you know, a lot of that field service process, and what you're eventually going to do is really just kind of update that status to complete it, right? So there's different statuses that I could actually do, right? I could say that it's in progress, for example, as a tech, because I've been actually deployed as a part of it. And what you're going to see then as well is that there are rules in place then from a field service perspective that says, hey, wait a second, you can't do that. Like, you've got to go to your bookings to do that, to do those updates, right? So the cool thing about this is that the business logic then that's being respected on field service is also then being respected inside of here. So if I look at, for example, those bookings that were created, and I actually discard, for example, those changes, what I should see obviously is that new booking that we created inside of here. And then in this booking, for example, this is where I can then do some of those updates, right, in terms of that work order, who's needed for it, where the install is going to occur. From a field service perspective, what warehouse defaults this in terms of the alignment then of that, right? So this bookable resource then for that setup drives really then this booking that I may interact with. And as you can see here, this is where I could then, for example, update potentially those different types of statuses. And if you're using basically the field service mobile app, what's usually occurring here is that those bookings are front and center that you're then interacting with basically to then do that alignment of whether or not you're on site, what that status of that booking is. As you can see here, we could then take those for different statuses and then do saves and updates that are related to it. And then the times, as an example here, are then also required. So actual arrival time, as an example, would be something in field service here that I want to go through and then specify to say, yep, I just arrived here at this date and time, and then I can save and close that, and as a tech, I could start working on that, right? Now, eventually what's going to happen here is a work order finally, after in progress, is going to need to be built and completed, right? You can see we had kind of that work order process that was showing up there as a part of it. But eventually what's going to happen is we're going to get to this completed status, right? And when we get to completed, this is where we have some of those different types of actions, right? Like our post action as a part of it to complete it would go through and then update those bookings then inside of field service and then save those updates inside of here, right? So the point here is that when we're doing those different types of transactions, what eventually is going to happen inside of Business Central here is that when we actually have the synchronization job that's running in the background, what we're going to see then is that with that project, so if we go back into our projects, we're going to start then getting transactions that are going to post basically against that project. Now you can always go to the project, for example, here and look at the statistics or the ledger entries that are related to it. In this example, we don't have any ledger entries yet because really what's going to happen here is from a project perspective, we're actually going to have a project journal that's going to be populated with that, right? So if we type in project journal as a part of this, what we're going to see then is that these journals are really then, from a field service integration perspective, are really then those templates that are used as we go through that, right? So here you can see that we have then some transactions that have come from field service that then need to post basically to that project. So you can see here I've got a couple of them that have actually gone through and processed. And basically what's happening is that this list is being updated with that integration toolkit, right? So as I've gone through and completed those particular work orders inside of the system, as we actually are updating those, so if I even go back to the work order and we look at that as an example here and open that work order up, well, this work order now is in a completed status. We said that as we posted those, basically those transactions, that it would import those. So we set it to used as an example. And then when that synchronization process runs, we're going to see basically this journal populate with that job number or project number. And then from there, we can then do the invoicing process from a job or a project inside of Business Central to then reflect basically what that invoice value is going to be. So pretty standard, right, in that regard. And that really is the detail, right, to that integration as a part of it. It provides then the ability for you to use really these capabilities and then not have to then use, for example, the field service perspective. The only other, or service management perspective, excuse me, the only other thing just to note here as well, we talked about like the bookable resource. There is a concept inside of Business Central called service items. And service items are typically then, they're very similar to a customer asset inside of field service. There is native integration for this as well, meaning that, if you go to your service item group, right, and your service item groups inside of Business Central, you would basically specify whether or not when you actually sell an item, like a desktop PC, as to whether or not it creates a service item, which would be a customer asset. It would be an asset that relates then to that customer that we sold it to. So the cool thing about this is that it respects that functionality as well, meaning this is base capability and service management inside of Business Central, which is, if you think about it, if you don't need advanced offline support, if you don't need geofencing, if you don't need the mobile app experience, service management inside of BC might be something to consider. But the cool thing about it is that the same functionality for service management that creates that asset can also be used then with field service. So that way, as you're creating new assets, selling serial numbers, selling lot numbers, or selling products themselves, you can basically then have the system create basically those customer assets. So that way then when you go into your assets inside of here, you're able to see then all of the customer assets that were also sold as well from Business Central inside of field service as part of that. So it's a really nice feature in that regard. So yeah, that was a lot to kind of go through at a high level from a field service perspective. As you can see here, it's getting better and better with each version as the release has been occurring. And we're really expecting, quite a bit of updates potentially to occur with that. Meaning, we've talked about like what's the inventory scenarios that we need to cover. Another example might be purchase orders. Right now inside of the Business Central framework, as you can see, the purchase orders aren't really synchronizing, right? So that would be something that maybe you do want to have happen, where a purchase order gets generated inside a field service for a tech for work. Well, you want to generate a purchase order inside of Business Central. Well, you probably want to then update that mapping really to then incorporate purchase orders as a part of it, right? So what we can do though is we can help you obviously through that to answer then obviously what particular data entities are integrated and which ones are not, to make that transition even easier for you. So yeah, that was a lot to go through. So we're at 12:03, a little bit over. I saw some great comments in chat. I do appreciate it. Like we said, learning is fantastic. I guess the big thing here is just remember that this integration, this is the very first iteration that we have from Microsoft with the field service integration. So it's a great place to start. It's a great place to experiment with, to see if you could use those capabilities. And once again, we've got a team here that can really help as we go through that. So with that, a very big thank you to everyone that was able to join for Confab today. If you have any questions, obviously feel free to reach out to us. We are more than happy to jump on a call to go even deeper, to show more specific scenarios that you may need. And really, I guess from 2 weeks from now, we'll have another Confab, obviously focusing really around these business solutions. And I hope to see you there is what it really boils down to. So with that, have a fantastic rest of your week, and we'll see you in 2 weeks on the next Stoneridge Confab.